Welcome everyone to this fifth edition of Monday Morning Human Intelligence. So this is where we spend 30 minutes to shake up your brain and get your week started off right. And I'm really glad to have today Daniel Gomez. So he's a new friend. He's a CEO of a company called First Person Experience LLC that focuses on creating experiences to generate teachable moments and transform people's thinking. He also, in addition to that, is an adjunct professor with Joint Special Operations University, working in their Center for Design and Innovation. And he is a veteran, and he's also a human intelligence instructor. So I'm really glad to have Daniel with us here today. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks so much, Dan, for having me.
So what we're going to talk about today is storytelling. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes having a conversation and teaching a little bit about storytelling, about how to tell a story, and about the power of storytelling. Not just that stories are good, but I'm going to let you know why they are good inside your own brain. And then we're going to spend the last 10 minutes. We'll have some time for questions, as well as anyone who wants to do a little bit of networking and let folks know who you are, where you are, and what your the type of folks you're looking to meet. We'd love to hear that as well. So I would like to start with really telling you about a story myself about stories, right? You can't start a storytelling lesson without a few stories. So the one that I thought of as I was working through this lesson and designing this curriculum was one night when I was flying in the A-10 over Germany. So I spent the first half of my career as a fighter pilot, and I was a relatively new pilot in the A-10, flying over Germany one night, going out to do some practice air-to-air refueling. I was still young enough in the A-10 that doing a air-to-air refueling was a new and challenging thing for me to do. And I was number 2 flying out on the way to the tanker. And I noticed that the lights on the radio switches were hard to see. I had to keep turning the intensity of the lighting up as we were traveling out there. And I'd turn it up and it would be pretty good. And then a few minutes later, it wouldn't be good anymore, and I have to keep turning it up until I had them all the way up to full bright, but I still wasn't really able to see them very well. And then as we approached the tanker, there's lights on the bottom of the tanker that you're supposed to look at to sort of guide you in to where you need to be. But those lights were really difficult for me to see. And in fact, I asked the tanker to turn the lights up, and my flight lead said, "Oh, man, they're up as bright as they ever are." So, well, that's really weird. So I get behind the tanker and I start taking gas, but I'm having a hard time staying in position, and I fall off the boom. And then I remembered that a few weeks prior, I'd heard a story about someone else who had talked about how things were getting dimmer for them at night and that they were having a harder time making decisions than they normally did. And I remembered what they said was that they were actually becoming hypoxic. Their brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. So I turned my oxygen regulator to 100%, and instantly I started getting the oxygen that I needed to make my brain work the way that it needed to work. I told my flight lead, and we descended and were able to go back home and be safe. But it was the power of that story and the way that it changed my mind, the way that it inserted itself into my own thinking, that eventually was able to help me keep the aircraft safe and keep myself safe. And that really drives home one of the lessons that pilots talk about, is that you need to learn from the mistakes of others, because you're not going to survive long enough to make all the mistakes yourself. And that's what stories do. They allow us to convey information in a way that is uniquely human and is powerful for the way that we function. So I'll tell you this real quick. So what does it mean to have a story? So stories need to have really these basic 3 parts. First, you need to have a character. The screen share is coming up. There we go. So you need to have a character, and that character needs to be involved in some predicament. And the story includes some attempted extrication from that predicament. And this is from a great book called The Storytelling Animal: How Stories Make Us Human by Jonathan Gottesall there. So in my story, clearly I'm the character. I'm telling you about my experience there. My predicament was I was becoming hypoxic and not realizing it. And my attempted extrication was remembering a story and then taking the actions that saved me from doing that. Right? The most powerful stories are those that talk about change, particularly human change. Our brains are tuned in to find out the way that things change and the way that people change over time. So if you have a story that isn't changing, I argue you don't have a story, right? The story dies. So something needs to evolve over time. And before this lesson started, I had this infographic up that included this very short 100-word story by Lydia Davis, where she uses this 100 words to create this story in your mind, right? She's not particularly precise about who the characters are, but you, by reading this quick story, you visualize at least two people that are out on this outing. The predicament is that there's some amount of anger involved, at least between two of them, and the attempted extrication happens somehow on this steep bank of dirt and is concluded by the weeping in the bushes. So even in that 100 words, she's able to take us along on a story and generate this this experience inside our own brains that leaves an impact. So I think that's a great example of how stories don't have to be complicated. You just need some a little bit of technical knowledge about how to tell the story and how to tune it in so it communicates best with humans. And Daniel, I think that's exactly what you do with first-person experience as well as your teaching. So I'd love to hear from you about how you've used storytelling in your own work or in your own life to convey ideas and connect with people.
Hey, thanks, Dan. So in my past life, I was an instructor for special operations at the United States Army JFK Special Warfare Center and School. So our job was to teach special operations, specifically civil affairs, to go do these special operations across the entire world. And that's dealing with humans, dealing with people, right? Dealing with warlords, drug dealers, Minister of Health, things like that. And we have to prepare our special operators for this uncertain world. And the greatest joy I had was teaching these special operators using story. So what we did was, how do we teach human dynamics? When I went through the course, we actually never had a chance to actually talk to people during the course until we got to the final exercise. And that was a massive 2-week-long excursion that was centered around a story called Pineland. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Pineland. It's where all the Robin Sage is held for special forces. And it's where the civil affairs and SIPE guys go as well. So we used the story to set the stage for the students' deployment. And as they went and created their own story, moving through Pineland and interacting with people, they learned a lot of things about themselves, right? They had what we call experiential learning. They were able to make mistakes, right? They go in, they talk to a warlord or an insurgent, they come out, and then the OC says, the observer controller says, all right, time out. And then you do your after action review. You go, so what do you think happened? And then the soldier would have to say what he was imagining in his mind. And then the instructor usually contrasted what actually happened and the perceptions that happen. And it becomes a story that people tell when they get back to base, right? Mm-hmm. So when the soldier experiences that, it's a concrete experience. They then get to reflect upon that, which is a step in Kolb's experiential learning technique. So, and then after they reflect on that, then they go into the what ifs, right? So I kind of insulted that insurgent leader when I did this. What if I didn't do that? And then in their head, they get to make a story that ends differently than what actually happened. And that's internalizing the lesson, right? So you get from a concrete experience to self-reflection to internalization. And that's the whole experiential learning aspect. Yeah, and what it does is it really gives that people a new way to approach things. It puts a tool in their toolkit that they can use at any circumstance when they approach it in their life later on. So that's how we use story and interaction and experiential learning all together to teach our special operators.
So I think that's great. I really appreciate you sharing that example. And I'd like to pull on two threads there, right? So I say that stories convey meaning, right? So lectures or memoranda or regulations convey facts. And you could stand in front of your students and tell them, here are the things that you need to do. But those are simply facts and they go into a different place in our brain. But stories convey meaning. So what you did with those soldiers is when they come back later and they're telling that story, right? They're forming those experiences in a way that they can learn something from it, right? Whenever we hear a story, we always are thinking, what's the moral? Or if it's a bad story, we wonder, like, why are you telling me this? Our brains crave meaning, right? They are meaning makers. Whether it's looking at a piece of toast and seeing a face, or we're doing some painting in my bathroom and we've spackled up the wall and I saw the face of Abraham Lincoln looking down sadly the other day. I'm like, Our brains cannot help but try to find meaning in everything. And stories, when they're constructed well, make it so easy for us to get that meaning, right? You say, this thing happened, then this thing happened, and now here's what I learned from it. And the moral of the story is you need to, slow and steady wins the race. And it's so much more powerful for us to communicate that because it fits into our brain in a different way. And the second part is that stories create experiences. So just like you said, your soldiers are able to sort of visualize and inside their own minds prototype what would have happened if I had done this differently. Our brains are powerful enough to do that. So it allows us to see these different experiences not only in our own mind, but when you were telling me that story, I was seeing myself in a version of Pineland that I had created in my own brain, seeing myself speaking to a warlord, and then imagining those experiences for myself. So I'm interested to hear like how the soldiers themselves respond to that experiential learning and versus more traditional classroom learning.
Well, they said it's the best the best training they've ever experienced in their life, and they say it all the time, consistently, day after day, because it ignites things in their brain that they've never done before. You're not in Pineland when we do our exercises. You're never right or wrong. There's a million rights, and there are very few wrongs, actually, right? So we're able to decide that. One time, before they went off to their exercise, one of the students asked me, what happens if you come across a situation in which a man is beating his wife? Well, the reason why he asked me that is because that's a piece of their selection. That's a scenario that they encountered during selection. And now during their training phase, this is a completely different exercise, right? But they wanted to know the answer. So I said, I know the person who can answer that question. And I chose a student randomly. I'm like, what's the answer? And then they hoed and hummed. And I'm like, oh, so you think I'm just like blowing you off, right? And they said, yeah. And I'm like, then shoot him. Shoot him in his damn face. And then they like looked at me and I'm like, oh, is that the wrong answer? I thought you wanted the answer, right? And here's the deal, guys. When you're out there in the middle of Africa, speaking Swahili with two men wearing kafayas, armed with M4s, and you don't have AC-130 support, who's there to make the decisions? That's you. You're the one that's going to make those decisions. I'm not going to be there. So I'm giving you guys the opportunity to go into Pineland and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes so that in real life, you hopefully don't make them again. And then they kind of appreciated it. They didn't really appreciate it until they finished the exercise. And they're like, man, talking to people is much harder than I thought it would be. Right.
Humans are complicated, right? So it takes.
Yeah, we're weird. Yeah. So that's the whole point is that, we're never going to give you the answer, right? Life does not give you answers. There is no answer, right? In life, you have to do what you can with the information available. And you have certain things that drive you, certain moral codes, right? Certain laws, certain beliefs. And you have to, and in this situation, that's the only thing you can rely on. I know it's kind of tangential from storytelling, but that's in special operations, you're with minimal guidance, away from other people, with minimal resources, and you operate in a gray area. And that's what we're training them for.
Yes. So the way that you communicated that story to your students and the way that you communicated it to us just now actually connects to another weird way that humans operate. So there were some researchers in 2010 at Princeton that put people into these functional MRI machines, right? Magnetic resonance imaging, so they can see how the blood is flowing in their brains. Then they had one person like spontaneously tell a story. So they told something that happened to them and they recorded the blood activity inside their brain. And then later they put people inside these fMRIs to listen to that story. And when they compared the blood activity in the brain of the speaker with the blood activity in the brain of the listener, when you were telling a spontaneous story, you had this tremendous amount of overlap. So close that they called it cognitive coupling. So that when you were telling a spontaneous story and I tune into you, our brains are doing like literally the same things inside their brains. And the more that you have that overlap, the better the communication is. And it only happens when you are essentially spontaneously telling a story. One of the researchers, Yuri Hassan, said that the story has to rise and burn in the living immediacy. It's not something that you can just recite, or it's not even as effective if you're reading it. It's something that is being formed and communicated in your own brain at that time. And just real quick, so I was thinking about some examples of that, and I went back and looked at Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963. I don't know if you know the story of the speech, but he had worked on the speech and had a speechwriter help him the night before. And he had a very prepared speech that's going, and nobody remembers that speech, right? He talks about a promissory note and coming to Washington, D.C. to cash a check. And he's sort of delivering this, and his delivery is flat. The crowd's not really reacting. And then Mahalia Jackson is over to his left about 50 feet. And she says, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And he starts this part of the speech that we all know. And he moves his notes to the side, and he speaks from his heart. And that's the speech that still moves people today, because it was burning in that living immediacy. So I think the lesson for all of us from that, for people who want to be storytellers, is to just communicate from your heart, right? To be authentic and communicate that lesson. I know that you have also done work with the adventures of a military brat, and you and your wife do work in storytelling in that way as well. How do those things connect, do you think?
Well, the Adventures of Military Brat is kind of interesting. We don't, we tell the story of seeing life through the eyes of a military child, right? And what they experience, the feelings that they feel, the how they look up to parents, or look, feel ostracized from other students because they're different, right? But what we do is we take those messages, those challenges that military life throws at you, and we turn them into positive events. So as we tell their story, and they overcome these challenges, we give them that positive look at that point of view. Because what that's doing is every challenge that you overcome, you build resilience in yourself. Mm-hmm. So the children are gaining resilience as they go through these trials, and in the end, they're better for it. Right. So we try to reinforce that bettering of them. And, so when they experience challenges later on, they'll be resilient to that, and they won't crumple like a flower. Right. So we tell the story. Our first book is a young boy whose dad just returned from deployment. So he's showing his cousin what it's like to be a military brat, and how he enjoys the camaraderie and saluting the flag and things of that nature. And the second story is a little girl who's PCSing. And we talk about how, she's sad that she has to leave her friends. She's sad that friends left her before, but she knows that if she remembers them and remembers those experiences and cherishes those, she can bring that to the new place, and she can even encounter even more positive experiences. So it ends with her saying goodbye. It starts with her saying goodbye to her house, and ends with her saying hello to her new friends, right? So it's things like that.
So, and you take these stories from your own experiences and your experiences with your kids, I presume, is that correct?
100%, yeah. It's a mix of our experiences with children that my wife has dealt with as well. But a lot of the stuff is that in those books have happened to us. Like, it was my son's, and I can't not get emotional here. But when we moved from our house in North Carolina, he left his bubble wands on the doorstep so that the next kids can play with them, right? Yeah. So it's stuff like that we added in the book that really happened, So in the book, the little girl leaves a note for the new family and things like that.
So I appreciate you sharing that with us, right? And that's really my fourth point about stories, is that conveying personal stories is like the supreme act of trust, right? That conveying personal stories where you talk about personal change is something that is very deeply embedded inside of us. So when we talk about collaboration, we talk about the importance of having psychological safety so that I can offer up my idea, and my idea is going to be respected. And those ideas are personal as well, but even more personal are those personal stories of change. Those things that were so deeply embedded in your own psyche and your own experience that whether it's your son or yourself, it took you from one path and moved on to another. Or even imagining the change that happens in the kid that shows up to the house that you PCS from, and they're having a bad day, and now they find the bubble wands that are there. And that's why
Yep.
sharing stories is often difficult for people, right? Sharing good, personal, transformative stories because they're so deeply embedded in us. So I'm going to go over just a little bit of time, but I'm going to tell you real quickly the very basics of how to tell a story. And Pixar, if you Google the Pixar story spine, that's a great place to start. They have some fantastic guidance for how to build whatever you're talking about into a story. But here's an even simpler way, right? So with your story, construct it around change. So first you say, before things changed, here's the way things were. Before this thing that I'm going to tell you about, this is what life was like. And then you talk about what is the thing that happened to cause that change. And then you say, because of that change, this happened, right? So for me, in the story I told about flying earlier, I'm talking about the day that I was flying around, and my vision started to get dim, and I started to be a little bit confused. And then this thing happened. That thing was, I remembered the story that I heard before, and because of that, I turned the oxygen to 100%, and I survived. It's structured in a way that leads you to change. And there are, whether you're telling a story about bubble ones or about flying or about, I know I've used story in some of my personal experiences from being deployed and helping to process through those. This is a powerful way to communicate that. When you tell the story, there's a great TED talk by Ted Lieber, and that's the sort of the V shape that you see in the bottom left there. And he talks about sort of the happiness of the character, right? That it starts out on a pretty even basis, and then the character goes into some deep low, and then learns something about themselves, and then comes back out at the top. And then that little curly Q is where you tie up all the loose ends. And when I look at our world today, whether it's the pandemic or it's social injustice or it's the financial crisis, I think a lot of us are in the very bottom. Hopefully we're at the bottom and it doesn't get worse, right? But we're at the very bottom of that V. And now it's a time to envision, what does the rest of that story look like? What do I need to do in order to have this climb out and then wrap it up at the top? And I think those are the most transformative stories that are the toughest to tell, but are the most powerful for folks that are that you're trying to communicate with. So we have,
and one of my,
please.
Oh, wait, okay, one
Yeah, please.
quote that I forgot her name, but the quote is, at any point in your life, you can say, "This is not how my story ends."
Yes.
I love that quote because it gives us power on what's happening and what the future will be, right? And it goes directly in that storytelling. Sometimes, they stories tie it all up at the end. Good ones do, but they also, after that, your brain doesn't stop working. So you start understanding different things. You start imagining different things. The magic, and God help me, but I'm going to bring Star Wars into this, right? The first 3 trilogies, you started in the middle of the story and then it never ended. So your brain works on all these amazing different pathways from those stories. Whereas you look at the more recent ones, they have these fake little box things that crush your dreams and your hopes and desires. And it silences all of your imagination. And that's specifically episode 8, right? Where it says, hey, remember we threw all these questions out there? Well, here are all your answers, suck on that, right? So sorry for me bringing Star Wars into this, but it's the differences between a good storytelling, lets you imagine and create more moments, versus bad storytelling, which ends everything and there's no choice, nowhere to go.
Yes, thank you. So we're a little bit long, but I think it's been a really good conversation. We have about 6 minutes left. So I've taken everyone, given you the ability to come off mute if you would like, if you have any questions, or if you would like to talk about sort of who you are and the types of folks you'd like to connect with. So I'll pause right here and see if anyone has anything. So I've got a question in the Q&A. That is, how many iterations of
LinkedIn me, so I'm going to LinkedIn Corey right now.
Good. So Trish asks, how many iterations of a story do you usually go through until you land on the final version? So there was another great TED Talk that I was listening to last night. And it's from I think it's actually entitled like the Pixar storytelling method. And I don't remember the guy's name right now, but he talked about how you, like he would go through the story 2 times, 10 times, 30 times, always looking to refine it and organize it in a different way. And I think that was a great lesson, right? That I'm not going to write the story and it be perfect. Even stories that I tell as a part of human intelligence, I go back and I look to reform those and see if there's a better way to communicate. Somebody with a hand up, Corey. All right, go ahead, Corey.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So I used to work for Center for Army Lessons Learned, and we used to have a lot of reports come in that explain, hey, this happened, this is what the unit did, and this is the outcome of it. And they still do a lot of written reports there. One of the things when I was there, I was trying to get conveyed to them is, hey, we need to have more audio and video recordings of after actions, because it's easier for someone to tell a story than to write a story. What's your guys' opinion about that?
So Daniel, do you have anything about?
So for the sense of, so I worked with Call for a little bit when I was doing my AARs for Iraq and sometimes like that. And, it's all about facts, right? ARs are just facts. And there's a reason why most people don't read them, right? Because it gives you the facts, X number of people were X number of insurgents were caught, X number of people deployed. Maybe we could do this better, but it doesn't tell you those stories. Now you look at the reading of Medal of Honor citations, or you look at the even change of command ceremonies and things like that. You'll hear these amazing stories about soldiers risking their lives to save their brethren, massive successes in giving people freedom and voting and reinvigorating economies and things like that. But those are not captured in the call. So I think if there was a way to mix the two, have an appendix of the facts and what we learned, and also use storytelling to get that message out there, I think it would be more effective.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of the difference between Medal of Honor citations and the narrative that accompanies those and lessons learned, right? The Medal of Honor citations are stirring and you want to find out what happened. And I've even read some of those just because I'm curious about what happened. I've never read a lessons learned report just because I wanted to know, hey, I wonder what happened to the number of insurgents we caught, right? That's great. Rebecca brings up a question where she asks how she gets through her issue of imposter syndrome. She says, I don't know if my stories are even ones that others would like to hear. And she's had a conversation with a friend of hers who is a CISO. So here's the thing about stories, right? Stories that are the best are those that are told from you, right? From your personal perspective, the ones that are authentically you. So you cannot be an imposter about yourself, right? If you're talking about you and the things that changed you and the things that shapes your experiences and your outlook on the world, you're the only person that knows that. So being able to speak from those is something that makes it, again, impossible for you to be an imposter. But people, when you tell a story, people want to know, right? How many times have you just heard a little part of a story as you're walking by someone and you want to find out how it ends? People don't like being left hanging. So people want to hear your story. You just have to construct it in a way that makes it easy for them to find meaning out of it. And part of that is understanding the meaning yourself, right? What was the change what was the event that caused the change? And then what was the consequence of that change afterwards? Daniel, looked like you were about to say something as well.
Yeah. And it's not, we're not just talking about storytelling. Well, we are. When you also tell yourselves these stories, right? Just remember that you tell yourselves stories like, hey, I'm an imposter, so I don't know if people will like my story. That's a story you're telling yourself, right? Unless someone says, you're the imposter, right? You're telling yourself that you're an imposter, right? So you have some control of that. You also have, but it works the other way, right? You could also tell yourself stories. I'm going to share my story and everyone's going to love it because people love stories. Well, then you run across the first person that doesn't love it. Then you feel bad because, you told yourself that story. But the greatest thing is that you control the story you tell yourself, right? No one else tells your story. You tell your own story. So it's all a mindset. It's a mindset on how you're going to portray yourself to the outside world, how you're going to drive yourself inside your own mind. It's all storytelling. So
25 seconds left.
I recommend you make it positive.
Yes. And like we end with so many lessons in human intelligence, collaboration in a psychologically safe environment is the key. So bring your story to the rest of us here at Human Intelligence. Tell us first, and let us be your guinea pigs. So I appreciate everyone's time here. We're running out. There will be a survey when you sign off. I'll leave the chat up if you have any questions, and I'll hang on for a few more minutes if anything comes up. I appreciate you spending your 30 minutes this morning with me. Thanks, Daniel, for being with us, and hope you all have a great week. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.